In this series of videos, we're going to look at vocabularies. So that's one of the 4 tabs here in the Facts Explorer. Now notice by default there are always 2 vocabularies here. One of them is called functions. And here, let me show you how that ties in. You might remember that we did some demos over here where we tried to add a couple months together. And what we did is we right-clicked here and we said function. And you see here we have add, day, day of week, and divide. And that's pretty much what you see over here. Add, day of week, divide, and so on. So those are pretty much the built-in functions. Then there are the predicates, which you see at the top here. When you do right-click predicates, after, before, between, equals, and so on. Those are defined here. Okay, so we want to make our own vocabulary now. So you go to the top and you say add new vocabulary. And let's call this loan demo. And then you have it's not saved yet, so you want to come down here, and they're just like rules. Every time you change something, you have to copy and paste it, and you end up having 4, 5, or 10 versions of every vocabulary. So we're going to say here add new definition. That's how you add a vocabulary element. And there are basically 4 types of elements. And so we'll probably break this into several videos. The first one we're going to do is a constant value, a range, or a set of values. So let's actually, now the most common one let's do is XML document, element or attribute. So what this could be used for example, is A, to make your screens more readable in the Business Rule Composer, or B, some people have this theory that end users could actually change the business rules. Now, I can't picture in the real world that an end user would actually come into this Business Rule Composer, especially on a production system, and change it. So there are ways you could abstract that, or maybe make a Windows GUI to let the users change certain values here. But the point is that vocabularies are one level of abstraction. They can take a complicated XPath, for instance, and turn it into a friendly name. So before we add this element here, let's go back and look at something in our schema. Okay, so we had a variable here called time in months, a place of residence. Okay, now let's say that the users call this something else, like time months in current residence. Okay, so they have a totally different name for that field. So what we're going to do is we're going to make more user-friendly names here. So we're going to say add new definition, click XML document, and then down here is the next button halfway off the screen. And the name of the field that the users will call it is months in current residence. Let's just make sure that makes sense. So we have place of residence and the time in months they've lived there. So months in current residence. And I think that's self-explanatory. Notice that when you put the name here, it puts the display name down here. And I don't know any reason why you wouldn't want those to be the same. But technically they could be different. But I would think that would be more confusing. So then here, you're going to have to go pick your schema from the disk. So we're going to do like what we did when we dragged and dropped fields into the Business Rule Composer. We're going to go browse to our library. And to save time again, I'm going to copy this directory name over, paste it there, and I'm going to pick the schema. And then once the schema is there, you have this picker utility that gives you a nice tree-level structure. And we're going to go to place of residence, pick time in months, and click that. And notice how it kind of fills in everything for you. So first of all, it built your document type for you, which we discussed in a prior video, is the .NET type name. And then here you have your XPath to that element name. And actually this is the XPath to this, what they call the selector, which is the node above it. And then this is the element within that area. And then what type of field is it? I don't know why they say decimal here, because I believe we made it an integer. So let's call it int32. Now, this is kind of disappointing, is that you can't have one variable to do both gets and sets. So let's say we're going to do a get here. You notice how the display name kind of comes and goes when I click get and set. So under get, let's put here, I hate to put get on the end of everything. So let's say if we're going to put set, we'll try to put the word set. Otherwise, we'll just use the word, the element name by itself. And then let's click finish. So now, since that was for the get, let's repeat the exact same process and let's add one that will set the value. So we'll go to XML element again. And so we're going to put the exact same name here, except months in current residence. Let's put the word set there. Then we're going to have to go browse our schema, pick it again, pick the same element again, time in months, place of residence. This time you're going to click set, and now notice how it put the word set. Well, again, it just copied it from here. So we now have the ability to set, and that also needs to be an integer 32. And the window's just hanging off the bottom of my screen here a little bit. Won't let me scroll up either. Okay, I'm going to have to expand my video to get down to the buttons. So let me pause and do that. I'm just going to hit the OK button, which is off the bottom of the screen here. Okay, actually it was called the finish button. Okay, now another sad thing about these rules are there's no GUI over here. So like right now, I see these two, but how do I know what they mean? Well, you can go to the properties window down here. So again, I kind of have to rearrange my windows. If you click here, months in current residence, you see it'll tell you the display name, the name, and the type. If I scroll on up here, the field alias, time in months, the schema that it comes from, the selector, all that information we saw in that other utility is right here. And then if we click the set, we should see just about the same thing. There's really nothing in here though that says whether it's just set or a get. So now we still can't use this field. We can't drag or drop it, it says, because it has not been published. So before you can actually use these fields in a rule, you have to publish the vocabulary. So now you're not only publishing rules, you're also publishing vocabularies. So we're not ready to publish yet because there might be some other things we want to add. So let's go back and say here, add new definition. And now this time let's use the database. So we're going to click database, table, or column. Click next. And we had two fields from the database. Let's call it DB customer ID, database customer ID. And it's going to be a database connection. We're going to browse again to that database table. And it's in the Northwind database. It was called the customer info, and it's the ID field. And we're only going to be doing retrieval on these. So we click that, and then we click finish. And notice the icon over here. For a schema, it's kind of a hierarchical tree structure. Looks almost like an orchestration. For database, it's obviously a little disk drive or database symbol. So now we're going to repeat the same thing with database, and we're going to add the balance field. So just so I remember, well, we can actually hit this first. Let's browse, go to the database. I don't remember what the field was called. It was called credit card balance. So up here in the definition name now, I'm going to call it DB, credit card balance. And okay, it's automatically got an integer there. I would have thought that would be a decimal. And we want this to be a get. And then we click finish. Okay, so in this video, I think we're just going to do these two for now. These two different types of fields, two database fields and two schema fields. What else is available here is the .NET class, but we haven't really written any .NET classes yet that would be compatible. So we're going to have to write the class and put it in the GAC before we can really do that. The other one is the constant value range or set of values. That will take a little bit of explanation, so I'll do that probably in the next video. So in this video then, we're pretty much done with this vocabulary. So we can do a save here, and then we right click publish. Now there is no deploy. There's only a publish and a save. Whereas rules, you publish, you save, then you publish, then you deploy. So now I can use this vocabulary in my rules. So I have a version 1.2 here that's saved, but it's not yet been published. So I can still make changes to it. And let's look at some of these rules. Notice here they say Northwind Customer Info ID. So I'll show you so you can see side by side. I'm going to insert here another predicate and say equals. And now I'm going to go down to my vocabulary. Remember before, to put this Northwind customer ID here, we actually dragged and dropped it here straight from this database. We just dragged like this, and that's how we got it there. And remember, I can click it and hit delete and remove it as well. So this time, instead of copying it from the database column, remember vocabularies are like a level of abstraction. So I'm abstracting the database fields into simpler names. So here it's going to be called DB customer ID. So before we had the syntax of the database name dot table name dot ID, and now we have just a more simple DB customer ID. So in this case you can see it's really not a big difference, but this would allow you to reclassify or categorize or name the field whatever you want, rather than having this full syntax. In other words, if you had a long database name and a long table name, this might be something like, development system underscore Northwind dot customer info table record dot ID. It might be a really long name. So here we can shorten that down. So now we're testing it here to see if it's equal to the ID of the in the XML, and we did not create a vocabulary for that one. So let's say we say, whoops, we should have created a vocabulary for that as well. So what do we have to do? Just to show you, we got to come down here, copy our entire vocabulary, paste it again, and now we have version 1.1 not saved. So we would come here and we would add a new definition, and we want to add the ID out of the XML. So we'll call this see, I could just call it ID. I could call it XML ID. I could call it customer ID, or I could call it loan request customer ID. It's all up to you, how you want to name this. Or it could be loan application customer ID. I kind of like that. The XML coming in is really a loan application, for instance. So I'm going to go browse back to my XML. I'm going to click on the ID here. It should be a string field, or is it a string? It really should be a number, because in our database I think maybe it's a number. Let's go check, because this is where your types kind of have to match. So here we have an ID, but we don't really know what it is. If we expand our columns here, we see that ID is actually in varchar. So apparently IDs do not have to be numeric. So that's important to know. So back to our composer here. We'll leave it a string, and we'll call this a get, and we'll click finish. And now we'll save that and publish it again. Now, in a way here I've set you up for a slight problem in the future. What we've done now is this DB customer ID is actually coming from this this version 1.0 of the vocabulary. And now if I drag and drop Loan Apple customer ID here, we now have, this is from policy 1.0 and this is from 1.1. Let's see if we can see that down here in our little property window. See right here, it says vocabulary link loan demo 1.1. And if I click the customer ID, it says it's coming from 1.0. So knowing this, what I would probably do now is I would redrag. I would delete this customer ID and I would drag it from here. But when we get to the deployment section, this is where this is going to be kind of crazy. It seems like BizTalk is actually missing a utility here. What they need to do is somehow upgrade where you only need to publish one policy, or vocabulary. So what happens is if you were to migrate this whole system to production And for instance, if I did not do what I just showed you there, if I still had this customer ID here, everything will still work, but the problem then is you have to actually take both vocabularies and move to your production system. So you can't just always move the highest vocabulary. It might be a best practice that you need to move all your vocabularies, which is kind of kludgy because most of them have the same thing in them. It's just you add each time some new fields. So I don't think there really is, unfortunately, a really good best practice here. It seems like what they need is utility that would go back into your policy and find any rules or any vocabularies that were from prior vocabularies and upgrade them to the new vocabulary. But there is no such utility. I've thought about writing it, but I think it would just take a little bit of time, and I haven't done that yet. So we now have this line here is basically the equivalent of this. So now I can delete that one, and I can click here and say move up, for instance. And now what if I wanted to redo this rule? The 500 doesn't have to change. So right here, credit card balance, I can delete that, and then now I can put my vocabulary here. So now you can see how this is maybe a little easier to read than what we had before. If we go back to the, let's see, we're in the commitment status rule. If we go back to version 1.0, you can see how long it was and how it kind of scrolled off the screen here. And you can see how a user would look at this and they would say, what does that mean? Northwind they might understand, but Microsoft samples.biztalk.loan processor case root/ID they probably wouldn't understand. So now what we've done is we've made it more humanly readable. If the database customer ID is equal to the loan application customer ID, that's something a user could understand. And so even if you used Snagit or some screen capture program and you printed this and put in a Word document and showed it to the users, they would be able to follow this a lot more easily. And that's one reason for using, that's really probably the only reason for using, well, I won't say the only reason, but for the vocabularies we've done so far, all we're really doing is just giving simpler names to more complex things. And later when we get to the fourth type, when you call a .NET or the sets, then there might be some features you have that aren't available otherwise. So that pretty much concludes this video on Introduction to Vocabularies, and in the next video we'll talk about some of the other vocabulary features that are available.